Hey, I want to talk a bit about the subject of football hooliganism. Now, I'm going to approach this video by talking about two infamous disasters in the 1980s. One of them was very much connected with hooliganism, the other one not so. Actually, I'm going to mention the second disaster first. Now, people might say, well, if you're talking about hooliganism, why are you mentioning this? The reason I'm going to mention it is because I think it's very important to understand the context of the 1980s. I'm 30, so I was only a child at that time, and I certainly don't remember it firsthand, but it's a subject I have studied closely. I've done a lot of research on this, and I've watched many documentaries, and I've reached my own views on it. Um, to be absolutely clear here, I have enormous sympathy and compassion with what the victims of the Hillsborough disaster went through over 27 years, and I would never ever assume that I could ever really understand that. I've never been in their shoes. I've never had to go through that sort of trauma. And the handling of it was an utter disgrace. It is true that the Sun newspaper absolutely distorted what happened, and numerous independent inquiries have ruled that it wasn't hooliganism that caused this, but the crowd problem and basically overcrowding. It seems to me that the right approach at the time would have been to simply not allow that second gate to be opened. There's other factors at play as well, though. There's issues like the state that stadiums were in. As I understand it, the stadium in Hillsborough was quite an old stadium. 4 years before in Bradford had been that awful fire. Um, so I think there was a accumulation of different problems. There has been a lot of criticism levelled against South Yorkshire Police. One thing I think needs to be kind of put out there because maybe it hasn't been spoken about enough. And I've seen this based on the first-hand video footage and news reports from the time. There were police officers that day that were had heroic actions. They tried to save people. So I understand why South Yorkshire Constabulary has got the controversy it's deserved, especially the commanding superintendent of the day. But I think people should be careful before vilifying the whole force and sort of demonizing individual officers. I mean, they must have been as traumatized as anyone else by this appalling disaster, which actually is the third worst football disaster in history. The worst was 1964 Lima. The second worst, I believe, was in I don't know if it was Accra or Abidjan, 2001. I think it was Accra, Ghana. And Hillsborough, Sheffield, 1989, was the third worst football disaster in history. So not only is this a profoundly big event for Liverpool, for the United Kingdom, but also actually in world football, it's a major event. Um, I fully understand and respect that the emotions about Hillsborough are very strong in Liverpool, and I would never ever want to deliberately or intentionally hurt or provoke anyone. But my thoughts on this are that the 1980s, there were things that were going on at that time that, if they don't justify the response to the disaster, I mean the initial response, they do explain it. Now, it is true that the fans have been vindicated from any wrongdoing, but what people forget is the 1980s. This is an irrefutable fact. The 1980s, there was a very serious problem with football hooliganism, and Liverpool fans, frankly, were not immune from that. 4 years before, and this is the second disaster I'm going to talk about, Heysel. Now, I'm sorry, but what happened at Heysel was one of the most ugly, glaring examples of football hooliganism I can think of, maybe the very worst. It has been called the darkest day in UEFA's history. Um, Basically, in that event, both sides were culpable. Juventus wasn't totally blameless. They were committing violence as well. The Juventus fans. Then Liverpool fans responded, and this resulted in a crush, 39 people killed. The youngest victim was an 11-year-old girl. Now, that to me is a glaring example of when people trivialize hooliganism when they act like it's just banter. Um, I would just say that one word, heisel. Basically, that was the very darkest side of human nature coming through there. That there were hooligans actually gloating about this disaster as people were dying. So there are some who say that Hillsborough was karma for Heysel. I think that's pretty crude, and I think it's wrong to suggest that because, for one thing, not everyone at Hillsborough was at Heysel, so that's just nonsensical. Also, it has been established that Hillsborough was an accident, and it had almost nothing to do with hooliganism. But I think the responses of the police need to be understood, the environment they were working in at that time. Hooliganism in the 80s was known as the English disease. This is a fact. And I challenge anyone to refute that as a fact. It doesn't justify the terrible handling of the disaster, but I think it has to be put out there. Let's say South Yorkshire Police had turned people away that day. Is anyone really convinced that the fans would have just went away and just say, oh, that's a pity. We'll just, come back to the next match. I don't think so. I think it's very conceivable there would have been trouble. Now, that isn't the same as smearing the victims because, many of those victims were completely innocent people just enjoying a football match and they died in tragic circumstances. So please, please, please don't think that's what I'm saying for a second. If you're from Liverpool or you've any connection to the disaster, that's not what I'm saying. What I am saying, though, is that I think the context of the time, I mean the time itself, I'm not talking about the subsequent treatment of the case and the misinformation that's been out there. I'm talking about the context of the time. Of I think this is just an obvious fact. Um, so when people say that the fans were 100% innocent and this all just they sort of act like it all came out of the blue, like this was that there was no context in that situation. Not that the context would justify what happened, but when I think about what happened at Heysel, I absolutely 100% understand the hardline approach that was taken in the late 80s to this problem. And if that meant bad judgment, that was perhaps a side effect of the situation that was going on. And it's not an excuse because the handling of the event was disastrous. But um, anyway, talking about this just gets me on to the next point, which I really want to talk about, and that is hooliganism itself. I've always detested football hooligans. I've never accepted the argument it's just male banter, it's just frustrated young men. Bullshit. It just doesn't weigh up. And I also resent this idea that if you condemn hooliganism, you're some sort of you know, better male who doesn't who's a pushover, who doesn't, he's effeminate or something, and it's this notion that basically I'm acting like a mindless baboon somehow qualifies you as a man. It's this idea that this degenerate criminal behavior is something to be proud of. And what sickens me is that cyberspace is full of videos with low-life hooligan scumbags promoting their criminal activity. And what bothers me is that people think it's a trivial thing. The thing is, if it was just a case that they were fighting with each other, that would be one thing. It would still be problematic because it casts a negative reputation on society as a whole. But the fact of the matter is, it does impact other people. When hooligans, and I'm not talking about any particular firm or any particular club here, decide to have a mass brawl at a train station, and I got caught up in that once in, I believe it was Glasgow Central. Um, it's a quality of life infraction. uncivilized citizens who are trying to mind their own business. Um, if you're so fucking brain dead and such a sheep that you need to act that way to feel like a man when you're all tanked up and you're in a group of other degenerate fools, you know, you might have muscles, you might have steroids, you might you might be able to have a fight, but as a human being, you're the lowest of the low as far as I'm concerned, because this has nothing to do with unleashing tensions or frustration at society. As far as I'm concerned, they're excuses made up by sociologists to justify this behavior. Um, I absolutely 100% support the police taking a very hard line on this. Um, in a clear cut situation where they're facing a bunch of rampaging thugs, I absolutely support them 100% cracking down hard. That doesn't mean I support the police, overreacting to and, picking on people who are not causing trouble, because there has been a few examples of that. But it just irritates me that people make excuses for hooliganism like it's a little thing. Um, I have no respect for what hooligans themselves think because I have contempt for them. I think they're degenerate, sociopathic thugs. And I also think they're fundamentally cards because they rarely fight one on one. Usually it's a mob of them attacking one person from the other side and vice versa. Um, and these people are not immune from hurting innocent members of the public. There's been many, many examples of that. So anyone who thinks, oh, it's just internal, that's naive because it's not. It's just not. I mean, I have the same contempt for people who cause this sort of trouble at any sporting event, but football, more than any other sport, at least in Europe, has this issue. And it isn't just Britain. It's a huge problem in Turkey and Egypt. In the Balkans, it was very much politicized. It's obviously a huge problem in Italy, but wherever it exists, it's the same excuses. And what's interesting about this is most of the violence takes place outside stadiums. And a lot of the time, it isn't even about the details of the football match itself. It's about fighting for the sake of fighting. If you want to be a fighter, go to a boxing gym, train, and become a boxer. And there's a world of difference with that because there's discipline involved, there's respect involved, and if you really want to fight, if you want to unleash tension, do that. But putting a brick in someone's face or five guys beating up one guy, you think that's the actions of a man? No, it's the actions of a degenerate criminal card. And if people think I'm being too harsh or I'm overreacting, again, Heisel. I keep emphasizing that 39 people lost their lives because of this utter stupidity. And it wasn't just, other hooligans who were killed. They were completely innocent people. An 11-year-old girl lost her life. She would be 41 now. So this isn't just mine, male banter. It's just outright criminal thuggery. That's all it is. And I don't really care what people think of me. I don't care if people think I'm old fashioned or ultra conservative on this. When it comes to issues like this, I am pretty conservative. I don't deny it. Because I don't believe you can negotiate with this. I don't believe it should be a case of saying, oh, well, please behave and we'll give you a lenient sentence or something like that. No, they have a choice and there's no excuses for what they do. And sociology should stop making excuses for them. To be fair, the situation has improved a lot. Um, Pretty much every football club in England, Wales, and Scotland has taken a hard line on this, though the situation in Scotland also involves sectarianism, I have to say, which complicates matters. But I'd say overall it has improved, and that's definitely to be welcomed. And one reason it has improved is because a hard line was taken. Football clubs said, we don't want anything to do with you if you bring our club into disrepute. We're going to give you lifetime bans. And it's not to say the problem's completely gone, but it has definitely improved. Nowadays there's a lot of focus on, this might sound like I'm changing the subject, but it's got relevance. There's a lot of focus on the bad behaviour of Chinese tourists abroad. There's been a lot of videos about that. But here in the UK, there was a period right up until I'd say the mid 2000s when the behaviour of Brits abroad was utterly, utterly embarrassing. And very, very often it was connected to football. Personally, I don't really see why alcohol should be served in flights at all. Because when you have a contained situation like that, um, but the thing that bothers me most about this is it's just pure cardly. It's cardly, when hooligans say they're just doing it for a laugh or they're doing it to because they're frustrated with society, whatever other reason they come out with. And it's cardly, not only because they're not taking responsibility, but because they're sheep. They follow the crowd. It's a case of strength in numbers. That is a card's mentality. The only time that sort of mentality is justified is in absolute cases of self defense or defending more vulnerable person. But as a general rule, mob mentality is just that, mob mentality. It's not brave, it's not noble, it's just degenerate nonsense. So sometimes I have to be quite honest with here. Sometimes I look at parts of the world that have very hardline laws and we're very critical of it. I'll cite an example, Singapore. Now, in the West, we're often critical of the situation in Singapore. We say they overreact and so on. But sometimes I really wonder when I look at things that have happened in this country, and we're very far from perfect at the moment. Not that we'll ever be perfect, but Britain has this very, very serious problem with yob culture. And it isn't just in football, although that's been a big issue. It's also in the problems we see in our nightlife all the time. And to be clear here, I'm not a Puritan. I like a drink. I like to smoke occasionally. I like to have a good time. It's nothing to do with being puritanical, but it's about just acting like a civilized human being. That's it. And yeah, I sometimes look at countries like Singapore and really think, well, maybe they're not entirely wrong. Maybe we should take a much harder line. And I'm not saying that the answer is just to throw everyone in jail. I'm not saying that. But I do get absolutely fed up with sociologists and others trying to find the reasoning behind this. Whatever the reasons are, it can never serve as an excuse. By the way, some people say, oh, they're unemployed wasters. Well, yeah, it's true some of them are unemployed, but you know what? There have been examples of hooligans arrested, i.e., guys involved in football violence, and it is almost overwhelmingly male, um, who have been lawyers, who have been, in one case, it was a firefighter. In other words, he had a respectable job at, daytime, but in his off time, he was just yet another criminal reprobate. It's almost like a Jekyll and Hyde thing. So on one hand, you're saving lives. On the other hand, you're having no respect for life. What sort of mentality is that? So that just counters this view that they're all from poor backgrounds and they're all, there have been professional people caught up in this because they somehow think, it's the same degenerate mindset. They may be wealthier, they may come from a more respectable background, but they still fundamentally have the same regressive mindset. And I suppose you could say there's a very long tradition in this country, and there is historical reasons for a lot of this. I mean, if we look at British history, Britain's always had this sort of yob culture on some level. I mean, medieval villages used to play football between them, and that wasn't exactly a polite game. People, it would be really rough. And this country's always had, let's say, a rough fringe. I suppose you could say that about any country, but what angers me about this is if it was a case of they were just going to the field and fighting among themselves, I'd say okay, well, they're idiots, but let them get on with it. But the point is, it's not that case. It does impact other people when they decide to have a mass brawl outside a train station or in a public street, or they trash up a pub, they destroy someone's business. Then yes, it does involve other people. That's why I really, really do believe a hard line is right. And the reason I mentioned Singapore is because they simply wouldn't let it happen. They would make them think twice about ever doing it again. So I do believe the custodial sentences could be part of the answer, but there's more to it than that. Anyway, I'm going to round this up. Again, the only reason I mentioned Hillsborough is because I'm talking about the context of the time. I have to really emphasize here that I'm well aware that Hillsborough, it has been absolutely determined that that was grossly distorted by the sun and so on. And everything that's said about Hillsborough is already well covered, so I don't need to add to it. But all I'm talking about is the context of the time. And it is an absolute fact that between the late 60s, early 70s, and the mid 2000s, this was a very serious problem for this country, especially in the 80s. It's irrefutable.